Okay, now let's look at a little bit more vocabulary. So the big picture, when we're doing a hypothesis test, we start off assuming the null hypothesis is true, and we're trying to gather evidence in favor of the alternative hypothesis. That's the one that's like our accusation. We're trying to gather evidence for that. After we get our hypothesis set up, then we're going to collect some data, and from that data, we're going to make this calculation, come up with this thing called a test statistic. And the test statistic is the value that we'll use to make our decision about what the result of our test is. Okay? And the way we do that is we say that if our test statistic is this thing we call statistically significant, then that means we have strong evidence against the null hypothesis, so we will reject the null hypothesis. Okay, that means we've got strong evidence in favor of the alternative hypothesis. Okay, so what does it mean to be statistically significant? Well, we start out assuming the null hypothesis is true, and if we assume the null hypothesis is true, that kind of gives us a normal curve to work with over here, based on the central limit theorem. And so we've got this normal curve. So we've got this range of values that we expect our data to fall in if our null hypothesis is true. And so the idea of being statistically significant is that if we expect our data, our test statistic, to fall somewhere, in around the middle of our normal distribution based on our assumption of the null hypothesis, and if we get some test data that's way outside of that, or maybe it's way over here in a place we would not expect, then that means we would call that statistically significant. Okay, we get some sample data or a test statistic from some sample data that's out of the range of values we would expect if the null hypothesis is true. So that means we have evidence that maybe the alternative hypothesis is true instead. Remember, they're opposites. Okay, so this level of significance is this thing that we call alpha. Okay, and you'll remember, hopefully, and if we go back and draw our picture of our curve, that confidence is this area in the middle of the curve, and then this alpha is the area in the two tails, right? So this is alpha, which is our significance level. So the area in the middle of the curve, that's what we call confidence, but the area out in those tails is what we call a level of significance. Okay? And it's related to confidence. Remember, the whole thing equals 1, so to get the area in the tails, we do 1 minus the confidence. And then the idea is we've collected our data, and we've got this idea of statistical significance now. So if we get a test statistic that's outside of the range of values we expect to get if our null hypothesis is true, so we get some unexpected data based on our assumption we make at the beginning, okay, then our decision here would be to reject the null hypothesis. We'll say there's evidence in favor of the alternative hypothesis, so we reject the null hypothesis. If we don't get that good statistical significant evidence, then we fail to reject the null hypothesis. Okay? These are the only two conclusions that are possible when we're doing a hypothesis test. We're not really proving anything 100% ever, okay? And we're not accepting any of the hypotheses. We either reject the null hypothesis or we fail to reject the null hypothesis. And these two outcomes they don't carry equal weight. Okay, when we reject the null hypothesis, that's a really strong statement. Okay, so remember, if we're thinking about the alternative hypothesis as being an accusation against the status quo, then rejecting the null hypothesis is like looking somebody in the eye and calling them a liar. Okay, it's got a lot of consequences around it. It's got a whole lot of weight. Okay, but if we fail to reject the null hypothesis, that's a really weak statement. Okay? That's saying, well, based on the evidence you have, do you think the alternative hypothesis is true? And you say, well, I really don't know, so I just can't really say anything, so we just fail to reject the null hypothesis. So rejecting the null hypothesis is a really strong statement, and we've got strong evidence. and that strong evidence supports the alternative hypothesis, HA. If we fail to reject the null hypothesis, then that's a weak statement. And that just means we don't have much evidence. In favor of the alternative hypothesis. Okay, so there we don't have strong evidence, so we just kind of stick with the status quo. But if we do have strong evidence that supports our alternative hypothesis, then we reject the null hypothesis, and that's a very strong statement.